Alright guys, what just happened should not be underestimated because this is not a press release, not a symbolic summit, and not another headline that fades in 24 hours. This is a structural move. Over the past months, BRICS has quietly shifted from being a discussion platform into something far more concrete, far more dangerous to the existing system, and far more difficult to reverse. Reports now indicate that cross-continental pipeline planning inside the BRICS framework has moved from concept to coordination. Not just energy cooperation in theory, but physical infrastructure designed to reroute how oil, gas, and eventually hydrogen move across regions without touching traditional sanction choke points. That alone changes the rules, because sanctions only work when flows depend on exposed routes, exposed currencies, and exposed intermediaries. What BRICS is attempting is to redesign the map itself. Now, here's the core thesis you need to understand early. This is not about collapsing the dollar tomorrow. This is not about announcing a new cartel. This is about building a parallel system that does not ask for permission. And once that system exists, leverage shifts quietly but permanently. Think about it. For decades, global energy trade has relied on a small number of transit corridors, financial clearing systems, and legal jurisdictions dominated by the West. Control those layers and you control outcomes. What BRICS is doing is removing those layers one by one. Pipelines that bypass traditional maritime routes, settlement mechanisms that reduce dollar exposure, long-term supply agreements that lock in volumes before markets even see them. None of this triggers a crisis overnight, but it creates a new baseline, and markets react to baselines, not slogans. That is why this moment matters, because once infrastructure is built, behavior follows. Producers prioritize internal flows, consumers plan around guaranteed access, external buyers face tighter supply and higher volatility. This is how power moves in the modern world, quietly, structurally, irreversibly if left unanswered. And the reason Washington never expected this is simple. The system was assumed to be too complex to bypass, too expensive to replicate, too divided politically to coordinate. That assumption is now under pressure. Now let's slow this down and examine the mechanism, because this story is not driven by ideology, it is driven by incentives. At the center of the BRICS strategy are two pillars that reinforce each other: physical connectivity and financial insulation. The pipelines matter not because they move oil faster, but because they move it predictably. When energy flows are locked into long-term routes, price discovery shifts, spot markets lose influence, futures react differently, volatility migrates outward, and here's the number that frames everything. With recent expansions and partnerships, BRICS-aligned producers account for roughly 40% of global crude output. That includes Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE, combined with demand centers like China and India. This is not a cartel in the old sense. No single price-setting body, no formal quotas. The power comes from prioritization. Internal contracts first, external markets second. The first-order effect is obvious: less flexible supply available to Europe and traditional buyers. The second-order effect is more subtle. Investment decisions change, refiners hedge differently, shipping insurance prices adjust. Now add the second pillar, financial insulation. By reducing reliance on dollar settlement and Western clearing systems, BRICS reduces the reach of sanctions without formally challenging them. Deals are structured bilaterally. Currencies are swapped. Exposure is fragmented. This does not eliminate risk, it redistributes it, and redistribution is often enough. Here is the rub. Sanctions depend on visibility and concentration. Once transactions are dispersed across currencies, jurisdictions, and payment rails, enforcement becomes slower and less certain. Markets price that uncertainty immediately, not as panic, but as premium, and premiums accumulate. Over time, this changes capital flows, bond demand, currency hedging behavior. It becomes harder to weaponize finance without collateral damage. That is why this is not an energy story alone. It is a financial story disguised as infrastructure. And infrastructure, once embedded, defines the playing field for decades, not quarters. At the same time, the move does not stop with oil and gas, and this is where many analysts miss the second layer. While the West focuses on decarbonization targets and electric vehicle adoption rates, BRICS-aligned countries are securing the inputs that make that transition possible. Lithium, cobalt, rare earths, graphite, these are not optional materials. They are bottlenecks, and the numbers are uncomfortable. BRICS countries control a majority share of global rare earth production and an even larger share of processing capacity. China alone refines close to 90% of certain rare earth elements. That means even if mining happens elsewhere, value capture happens inside the bloc. Now connect this to the pipeline strategy. Energy security today funds industrial policy tomorrow. Cheap, predictable energy allows capital-intensive processing to scale. Processing creates downstream leverage. Downstream leverage attracts manufacturing. Manufacturing locks in employment and political alignment. This is a self-reinforcing loop. First-order consequence: supply chains become geographically sticky. Second-order consequence: trade policy loses flexibility. When your green transition depends on materials processed by geopolitical competitors, tariffs stop being tools and start becoming liabilities. This is why the BRICS strategy looks defensive on the surface but is offensive structurally. It does not confront the system head-on, it reroutes around it. And that sends a signal to the global south. Access without conditionality, infrastructure without lectures, financing tied to resources rather than reforms. For countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, this is a third option that did not previously exist at scale. That changes alignment math, not through ideology, but through contracts. And contracts last longer than speeches. None of this guarantees success. Internal rivalries remain. Logistics are complex. Trust is incomplete. But markets do not wait for perfection. They price direction. And the direction here is clear. Energy, finance, and industrial capacity are being fused into a single strategic architecture. The question is no longer whether this challenges the existing order. It already does. The real question is how fast the rest of the system adapts. Now the focus shifts to how the United States and Europe are reacting because this is where the pressure becomes visible. Publicly, officials downplay the significance. Privately, the recalculation has already begun. For decades, Western energy security rested on diversification through open markets. If one supplier failed, another filled the gap. But that model assumes supply is willing to compete in the same marketplace. The BRICS pipeline strategy breaks that assumption. When large volumes are pre-committed through long-term bilateral infrastructure, flexibility disappears. Europe experienced a preview of this after 2022, when Russian gas was removed from the system. Prices did not just rise, they became unstable. Governments were forced into emergency subsidies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Now imagine that dynamic repeating, not because of a single conflict, but because a growing share of global supply is structurally redirected elsewhere. The first-order consequence is fiscal strain. Energy price volatility feeds directly into inflation. Central banks face tighter constraints. The second-order consequence is political. Voters react faster to utility bills than to foreign policy speeches. Meanwhile, the United States faces a different dilemma. As a major energy producer, it benefits from higher prices, but as the issuer of the dominant reserve currency, it depends on system stability. When more trade happens outside dollar settlement, demand for U.S. financial assets grows more slowly. Not collapses, slows. And slowing is enough to matter when deficits are large. This is why Washington is accelerating alternative strategies, strategic mineral partnerships, subsidies for domestic processing, expanded LNG export capacity. None of these are immediate fixes. They are hedges, and hedges signal uncertainty. Markets read that clearly. The uncomfortable truth is that Western leverage was never just about power. It was about coordination. Once coordination weakens, even strong economies feel exposed. This is not decline, it is transition. But transitions are where systems are most fragile. Meanwhile, the financial layer is where the effects compound quietly. Energy trade and currency demand are inseparable. When oil is priced and settled in dollars, surplus revenues flow back into dollar-denominated assets, treasuries, equities, real estate. This recycling stabilizes the system. What BRICS is experimenting with is not a replacement, but a partial diversion. Even a small diversion matters. If 10 or 15% of large energy contracts settle outside the dollar, that is hundreds of billions in annual flow, the first-order impact is subtle. Slightly lower marginal demand for U.S. debt, slightly higher currency hedging costs. The second-order impact is structural. Risk premiums rise, borrowing costs become more sensitive to sentiment. Now add sanctions risk to that equation. Countries watching Russia's experience have learned a clear lesson. Reserves are only safe if they are usable. This is driving diversification into gold, regional currencies, and alternative payment systems, not because they are superior, but because they are harder to freeze. None of this implies an imminent dollar collapse. That narrative is lazy. What it implies is friction, and friction slows growth. Slower growth reduces policy room. This is why financial markets care about pipelines. They are not just steel and concrete. They are commitments that shape flows for decades. The BRICS approach reduces exposure to sudden policy shocks. That predictability attracts partners who value stability over alignment. Over time, parallel systems do not overthrow the old one. They erode its exclusivity. And exclusivity is where leverage lives. The more options participants have, the less any single gatekeeper can dictate terms. This is the environment forming now, fragmented, multipolar, more resilient in some ways, more volatile in others. And volatility is the tax everyone pays. But here is where economics merges with security, because infrastructure cannot exist without protection. Pipelines, shipping lanes, processing hubs, these are strategic assets. And strategic assets shape military priorities. As BRICS connectivity deepens, so does the incentive to secure routes. We are already seeing this alignment. Increased naval coordination, greater focus on maritime choke points, expanded presence near critical corridors. This is not preparation for war. It is preparation for continuity. The first-order consequence is deterrence signaling. The second-order consequence is miscalculation risk. When more actors patrol the same routes with overlapping interests, accidents matter more. Meanwhile, the Global South observes closely. For many countries, this is not about choosing sides. It is about reducing vulnerability. The BRICS model offers financing tied to infrastructure rather than governance conditions, energy access paired with industrial investment. This is attractive, and attraction reshapes alliances quietly. Over time, voting patterns change. Trade flows shift. Diplomatic language softens. None of this requires confrontation. It happens through contracts and incentives. This is why the current moment feels deceptively calm. No shock, no announcement of a new order, just incremental alignment. History shows that these phases are decisive. By the time disruption is visible, the foundations are already set. The world is not splitting into two camps. It is reorganizing into multiple centers of gravity. Energy is the anchor, finance is the lubricant, security is the insurance policy, and each reinforces the other. The danger lies not in intent, but in inertia. Systems drift until they collide with reality. Whether that collision is managed or chaotic depends on adaptation speed. That is the question hanging over the next decade. 1216. So now we arrive at the scenario layer, because direction alone does not determine outcomes. Execution does. Over the next 5 to 10 years, 3 broad paths emerge, each plausible, each carrying very different consequences. In the first scenario, BRICS cohesion holds. Infrastructure projects face delays but remain politically protected. Pipelines expand gradually. Settlement diversification increases steadily. In this world, the impact is cumulative rather than dramatic. Energy markets become tighter, but not broken. The dollar remains dominant, but less exclusive. Western economies adapt through higher costs and strategic subsidies. Growth slows, but stability holds. In the second scenario, internal frictions rise. Competing interests between producers and consumers inside BRICS intensify. Financing strains appear. Some projects stall. This produces a fragmented outcome. The system becomes messier rather than cleaner. Volatility increases. Prices swing more sharply. This is the least comfortable scenario for markets because uncertainty replaces direction. The counterintuitive third scenario is the most dangerous to underestimate. Western adaptation accelerates faster than expected. Mineral diversification succeeds partially. Recycling scales. Energy efficiency improves. At the same time, BRICS infrastructure overbuilds ahead of demand. Returns compress. Political patience thins. In that case, leverage does not disappear but shifts again. Not back to the old order, but into a more competitive equilibrium. None of these paths involve collapse. That framing is misleading. What they share is transition pressure. Institutions designed for a unipolar energy and financial system are now operating inside a multipolar reality. Policy mistakes matter more. Delays cost more. Overconfidence is punished faster. The lesson here is not who wins, it is who adapts. History rarely rewards the loudest actor. It rewards the one that adjusts incentives before constraints harden. So we end where we began, not with a headline, but with structure. The BRICS pipeline strategy is not a declaration of dominance. It is an insurance policy written in steel, currency swaps, and long-term contracts. It does not seek to replace the system overnight. It seeks to make dependence optional. That distinction matters. Power today is exercised less through confrontation and more through optionality. The ability to choose routes, currencies, partners, and timelines quietly shapes outcomes. The West still holds enormous advantages: capital depth, technological leadership, institutional credibility, but advantages erode when assumed rather than renewed. The danger lies in mistaking familiarity for permanence. Energy flows, financial plumbing, and supply chains do not stay loyal. They respond to incentives, and incentives are being rewritten. The world is not moving toward a single alternative order. It is moving toward a layered one. Overlapping systems. Redundant pathways. Competing centers of gravity. This increases resilience for some and risk for others. Stability in this environment is not achieved by dominance. It is achieved by coordination and flexibility. The choices made now will echo for decades, not because they are dramatic, but because they are embedded. Pipelines lock in behavior. Contracts shape alliances. Infrastructure outlasts governments. This is why the moment matters, not because of what was announced, but because of what was built. And once built, systems are difficult to reverse without crisis. That is the core lesson. The future will not be defined by a single shock, but by accumulated adjustments. Whether those adjustments produce balance or fragmentation depends on judgment exercised under pressure. So here are the real questions you should be asking. Can the West adapt its energy and financial strategy fast enough to compete inside a multipolar system without triggering instability? And can BRICS maintain internal cohesion long enough to turn ambition into durable leverage? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.